In this album are compiled many of the memorable images and echoes of 1963. We invite you to leaf through it with us for the next 2 hours.
Little more than 100 weeks ago, I assumed the office of the President of the United States. In seeking the help of the Congress and our countrymen, I pledged no easy answers. I pledged and asked only toil and dedication. These the Congress and the people have given in good measure. And today, having witnessed in recent months a heightened respect for our national purpose and power, having seen the courageous calm of a united people in a perilous hour, and having observed a steady improvement in the opportunities and well-being of our citizens, I can report to you that the state of this old but youthful union is good.
That was John F. Kennedy, January 14th, 1963, doing one of the few specific things the Constitution requires a president to do, reporting from time to time to Congress on the State of the Union. As he noted, he'd had 100 weeks in office then. The assumption was that about 2 weeks from right now, he would be beginning a new State of the Union report. His death, late in a year already full, dominated 1963. You will probably realize, watching, as we did putting together this album, what a different year it made of it. How long ago some events of May and March and September seem now. It's been quite a year. It's worthwhile to take another look at its events. Many of them, fascinating to relive in any circumstances, you'll find look entirely different now in the perspective of that tragedy we didn't dream was coming. For that reason, even though all of us will inevitably have that climactic event in mind as we look through this album, we'll put it at the end of the broadcast, at the back of the book, where it came in nature to change everything about this year that had gone before. You'll remember, for instance, that there was another funeral at Arlington this year. It symbolized as well as any one event what was until November 22nd the year's great story, the pressure by Negroes for civil rights and equality, what people began to call during the year the Negro Revolution. Medgar Evers, a field secretary of the NAACP, died in that revolution, shot by a night sniper in Jackson, Mississippi. They buried him in Arlington on June 19th, and Roy Wilkins of the NAACP spoke at the grave.
He believed in his country. It now remains to be seen whether his country believes in him.
God bless.
We shall all be free someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
Some people who had been there in Clinton and Nashville and Little Rock and Jackson always said that when the issue was joined in Birmingham, it would be the worst of all. This was Birmingham last spring, when the Negroes began to press and the city administration said no. Out of all this came a presidential commission to try to get the two sides together, some promises of gradual desegregation by a Birmingham civic committee, which the Negroes said were not enough and were not even sincere, some 2,000 arrests, and pictures which have replaced, in the propaganda of our enemies around the world, the pictures of Little Rock, which in turn replaced the pictures of nostalgic breadlines of the 30s and lynchings of the 20s. Birmingham is the city you remember out of 1963's racial conflict. But 1963 was the year also when the country became aware that it had a national ferment on its hands. Negroes lay down in front of trucks in New York City, asking for equality in jobs. They picketed in California housing projects and at Chicago schools. There were demonstrations in places like Anchorage, Alaska, and Phoenix, Arizona. But the place where you remember the dogs and the fire hoses was Birmingham. After this flurry, Birmingham seemed to settle down. There was a new mayor and a new police chief. The dogs were quiet, but nobody thought it was all over. If they had thought it was all over, they knew better on the morning of Sunday, September 15th, when a man or men threw a bomb into a Negro church and killed 4 Negro girls who had been at Sunday school. In the Sunday surging of people that began with the bombing, 2 Negro boys got killed. Birmingham's leaders said they were shocked and sorry, and they blamed an atmosphere of agitation and turbulence stirred up by outside provocateurs which turned loose the passions of the bombers. No whites were killed for racial reasons in Birmingham in 1963. No one has been charged with the bombing of the church. No one has been convicted for any of the more than 50 bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham since World War II. Alabama had another major day this year when Governor Wallace, at the door of the University of Alabama, met U.S. Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach.
I wish to make it clear to you that this is an awfully simple thing. We are asking today is a routine thing. It is simply the enforcement of a court order of which you are aware. And I've come here to ask you now for an unequivocal assurance that you will permit these students who, after all, merely want an education at the great university.
Well, you make your statement, but we don't need you to make a speech. You make your statement.
I will make my statement, Governor. I was in the process of making my statement. And I'm asking from you an unequivocal assurance that you will not bar entry to these students, to Vivian Malone and to James Hood, and that you will step aside peacefully and do your constitutional duty as Governor.
As Governor and Chief Magistrate of the state of Alabama, I stand before you today in place of thousands of other Alabamians whose presence would have confronted you had I been derelict and neglected to fulfill the responsibilities of my office. It is the right of every citizen, however humble he may be, through his chosen officials of representative government, to stand courageously against whatever he believes to be the exercise of power beyond the constitutional rights conferred upon our federal government. It is this right which I assert for the people of Alabama by my presence here today. Now, therefore, I, George C. Wallace, as Governor of the state of Alabama, do hereby denounce and forbid this illegal and unwarranted action by the central government.
Governor Wallace, I take it from that statement that you are going to stand in that door and that you are not going to carry out the orders of this court, and that you are going to resist us from doing so. Is that correct?
I stand upon the statement.
Stand upon that statement. Governor, I'm not interested in a show. I don't know what the purpose of the show is. I am interested in the orders of these courts being enforced. That is my only responsibility here. I ask you once more, the choice is yours. There is no choice that the United States government has in this but to see that the lawful orders of its court are enforced. Very well. Students will remain on the campus.
Katzenbach turned away. the orders went out to federalize the Alabama National Guard. A token force of guardsmen came to the campus. Governor Wallace yielded then, having, he said, made his point.
But for the unwarranted federalization of the National Guard, I would at this moment be your commander-in-chief. In fact, I am your commander-in-chief, and I am the governor of your state and your governor. And I know this is a bitter pill to swallow for those in the National Guard of this state. We shall now return to Montgomery for the purpose of continuing this fight, this constitutional fight, because we are winning. We shall continue to work for a better Alabama for all the people of this state, both white and Negro. And it is my prayer that God above shall bless all the people of this state, both white and black.
It was the last physical stand that Governor Wallace made this year, although his state troopers delayed desegregation of some other Alabama schools. On this day, after the governor left, James Hood registered peacefully. He later left the school. Vivian Malone registered and is still there, the only Negro at the University of Alabama. A long time ago, a Negro leader named A. Philip Randolph got the idea that if you could make a huge, peaceful march on Washington, it might show people just how much the Negroes care. Last summer, on August 28, 200,000 people came to the Capitol for that march. They were from North and South. They were white and black. They were well-mannered and neat and joyful. They walked from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. They stood in the sun and listened and responded to people like Mahalia Jackson and Dr. Martin Luther King.
We had a mighty hard time coming on over. You know my soul, look, I can wonder, how did I make it over? Well, soon as I could see Jesus, the man that died for me, the man that led and suffered, you know he hung on Calvary. And I've got to thank him for how he taught me. And I've got to thank God for how he taught me. Yeah! Thank God for how he kept me. Oh, I'm going to thank him for never left me. Yeah, I'm going to thank him for old-time religion. Yeah, I'm going to thank God for giving me a vision. Yeah, the joy, heavenly fire. Yeah, I'm going to count, never get tired. You know I'm going to count, come around me home now. Yeah, I'm going to sing, glory, hallelujah. You know I'm going to thank him for me. God's been so good to me.
Pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I still have a dream It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. That one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious races, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. One day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country, 'tis of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghanies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when the capital, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
1963, a television album with Harry Reasoner reporting, will continue in a moment.
This is WCBS-TV, Channel 2 in New York.
Americans have learned a lot of geography since 1942. It turns out that history's crises don't always take place in interesting, identifiable places like London or Pearl Harbor or Paris or even Berlin, although Berlin seems the most durable of all locales. But since the end of the last World War, we have become aware in various years that our principles and interests are on the line in all kinds of strange places where the weather is apt to be bad, our local friends unpredictable, our enemy vague but resourceful, our course unclear, our defeats embarrassing, and our triumphs unsatisfying. This year may have seen the most complicated involvement of all, and the year's end has brought no end to the involvement. 9 years ago, the United States, having reluctantly agreed to the partition of the country of Vietnam into a northern communist state and a southern non-communist state, somewhat pessimistically began helping the government of the non-communist area. The president of that area, of South Vietnam, a man named Ngo Dinh Diem, did better with his stub of a country than expected for a while. Then, along with continuing pressure from communist-supported guerrillas, he began to have more and more serious trouble with citizens who were not communist, but were very much against him. We are told that Diem became harder and harder to reach, more and more under the influence of a tough brother named Ngo Dinh Nhu and Nhu's wife. The Buddhists of Vietnam became convinced that they were being persecuted, and they introduced, to American eyes, an exotic and horrible form of martyrdom to show how strongly they felt. This is a Buddhist monk who has poured gasoline on himself and set it afire. He is burning to death in the streets of Saigon. In the same city, Madame Nhu last summer talked to Peter Kalischer.
What have the Buddhist leaders done comparatively? The only thing they have done, they have barbecued one of their monks, whom they have intoxicated, whom they have abused the confidence. And even that barbecuing was done not even with self-sufficient means, because they used imported gasoline.
Madame Nhu said later she didn't know enough English to know that barbecued sounded flippant. In any event, the conflict between government and Buddhists spread. Students who had kept quiet about with the government joined in protests. We kept getting reliable reports from the scene that the government was so out of touch with the people, so suspicious and introverted and repressive, that it could never win the stubborn war against the communists. There were fights in the streets, and the government made one big move, closing up monasteries and throwing Buddhist leaders in jail by the dozen. But resentment and riot and talk of revolution continued. And in late summer, it became known that the United States, with dozens of lives, hundreds of millions of dollars, and immense prestige involved, was quietly hoping for a change in government. In September, President Kennedy spoke plainly about our feeling in an interview with Walter Cronkite.
I don't think that unless a greater effort is made by the government to win popular support, that the war can be won out there. In the final analysis, it's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them. We can give them equipment. We can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it, the people of Vietnam, against the communists. We're prepared to continue to assist them. But I don't think that the war can be won unless the people support the effort. And in my opinion, in the last 2 months, the government has gotten out of touch with the people. The repressions against the Buddhists, we felt, were very unwise. Now, all we can do is to make it very clear that we don't think this is the way to win. It's my hope that this will become increasingly obvious to the government, that they will take steps to try to bring back popular support for this very essential struggle.
The situation did not improve. President Diem was inflexible, seemingly unwilling or unable to conciliate the Buddhists. General Duong Van Ninh, seen here with Diem in friendlier days, would become a key figure in the coup that overthrew Diem. It came on the 1st of November, and Peter Kalischer was there.
This is Peter Kalischer. I'm here on Cran Din Film Street. A coup d'etat, an armed revolt, has broken out in this city against the government of President No Din Diem. Two Vietnamese Air Force planes trying to make a rocket run on the palace. Troops hugging the walls of houses, the zing and whine of ricochet. The Vietnamese Marines are spearheading the assault. Plus paratroopers. Diem's palace is burning. Mortars. Go ahead, take it. And the Marines are going in now. Here they go. They're running and dodging for the palace gate. Gates are locked, so it's up and over the side, over the iron grill. The palace has fallen. The Marines are in. The prisoners are lined up with their hands in the air. The palace guard, they're swarming all over the grounds. Littered. It's a shambles in here. This once beautiful Jalon Palace. The Marines swarm through, hunting for Diem and his brother Nu, but they're not here, escaped perhaps through a secret tunnel. This is the face of Saigon on the day of liberation from the Diem regime. An officer comes to reestablish order, and he's cheered and carried to his jeep. The palace has fallen, a revolutionary junta has taken over, and the news has been broadcast that Diem and his brother No Din Nu have committed suicide. The people, the students, the ordinary people of Saigon cheering the troops, giving them bread, giving them bananas. The gift of the people of Saigon to their liberator. These troops have been fighting all night, they're hungry, and the people know it. Revolution is never pretty. This is the scowling face of Saigon, contorted by years of big and petty oppression, venting its spleen on whatever stands for the old regime. A mob of students sacked the National Assembly building, the symbol of a rigged election only a month and a half ago. Out go the government pamphlets, the propaganda, the leaflets. Down comes the picture of No Din Diem, and it's ripped and spat upon outside. And here one member of the mob tries to open the door of a car and drag out an unpopular former government official. They attack and set fire to a bookstore owned by Diem's brother, Archbishop Took, whose property investments have made him one of the richest men in Saigon. Books, good books, are torn and thrown in the gutter. The symbol of Madame Nu in Saigon is the statue of the Trung sisters, legendary national heroine, but a statue she erected, and down it comes. The head is carried around like a trophy.
It is not enough to try to kill or subdue the duly elected leaders of a country just because one wants to transform that country into a satellite. To kill or to subdue is easy, but what will happen afterwards? Treason does not pay, and nobody can rule Vietnam with just money and puppets. And all those who...
The coup had left Madame Nu a bitter widow in Los Angeles at the end of a world tour.
And all those whom some of the Americans intend to settle and to tutor, for how long will they hold the power, if they ever hold the power?
Just 6 days later, Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, appointed to his Saigon post only a couple of months before the revolution, was advised that Washington recognized the new government of South Vietnam and that the Vietnamese could count on our continued interest and support in the war with the Viet Cong. Correspondent Calicher went along on a typical mission.
Below is spread the lush and peaceful-looking Delta area. The checkerboard rice fields almost ready for harvest, deserted to all appearances, except that someone down there doesn't like us.
More machine gun fire. Broke up from the last. I'm climbing up and out.
One of the helicopters is receiving fire.
Wagon flight, this is 3-6. If you can observe that target, take him under fire. Okay, I want you to take it under fire. Wagon flight, this is 3-6. They got that bugger. Troops came out there and placed him up. They got him laying flat on his belly right in the middle of the bunch right now. This is 3-2. We have another insurgent spotted in the rice paddy. Want to pick him up or shoot him? Pick him up. This is Saber 6. Roger, we would hope to get the pickup made within the next 10 minutes, over.
Now this chopper is under fire. The Viet Cong hide in the flooded rice paddies, fire once, and then often throw their weapons and submerge, breathing through a hollow straw. Lieutenant Tregesser brings us around for a rocket run. It's a dizzying orbit of steep banks and on-the-deck flying. And all of a sudden, everybody fires. And then everything breaks loose.
This is 6, Roger. You have 2 suspects in there.
Back at Tan Son Nhut, Saigon's airport that also services commercial jets, this is part of the operation results. 6 prisoners out of 23 captured. The rest are with the battalion at another checkpoint. And despite their woebegone look, they are Viet Cong. They were caught with grenades and documents.
The only trouble is that the war against the communists has gotten worse, not better. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara has just returned from his second visit to South Vietnam in an effort to find out what's wrong. As of now, the communist guerrillas are threatening to bring the war to the gates of Saigon itself. One American official says that if things don't get moving there, within the next 90 days, the war will be lost. And some of Madame New's predictions may be coming true after all. Pope John the 23rd, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, died this year. In a way, it could not be called untimely. He was 81, and some people thought he had been deliberately chosen in 1958 as a sort of interim pope, a man who might have been expected to have a short and uneventful reign while the church considered various paths it might take in a time of crisis. Well, it didn't turn out that way, as everyone knows now. This old man with the big nose and the great reaching-out soul touched men from Moscow to Manila, as no pope and few men have in our lifetimes. He transcended his denomination without belittling it. Because of John, his church is different to the people in it and to the people who look at it from outside. When you watched him, you felt warm.
La mia giornata è finita. L'ultimo pensiero.
My day has ended. My final thought is again a prayer and a blessing. And a blessing multiplied and diffused throughout the world.
Winston Burdett reported John's death and the solemnities following, including the election of the new pope whom John had hoped would be his successor.
Under this dome, 4 years and 7 months ago, Pope John the 23rd celebrated his coronation as head of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, in the warm dusk of a Roman evening, thousands of men and women have gathered in St. Peter's Square to witness Pope John's last journey. For the last time now, Pope John is to be borne in procession from the bronze door, the main portal of Vatican City, through the crowds in the great square, past the fountains, around the obelisk, and up the broad steps into St. Peter's Basilica, to lie in state on a high dais in front of the altar where he was crowned Pope. The noble guards, in their scarlet uniforms and plumed helmets, walk by the Pope's side in the procession down the Scala Regia, the royal stairway that comes down from the Apostolic Palace to the door that opens on the square. Pope John is carried on an open bier. Behind the bier come 19 cardinals of the Roman Curia, the men who head the ministries of the central government of the Catholic Church. Among them, Alfredo Cardinal Ottaviani, the head of the Holy Office. The procession descends to the bronze door. And the Julian choir sings as the cortege enters the square. In the procession are officers of all units of the Vatican's armed forces. Officers of the Palatine Guard lead the cortege. A company of Swiss Guards follows them. The Noble Guards are the honor unit that keeps constant watch over the Pope's bier. The crowd presses against the wooden barriers, but is silent. A silent tribute of affection to the man whom the Italians call the Papa Buono, the good Pope, and the Parroco del Mondo, the parish priest of the whole world. And they call him also the Papa del Sorriso, the smiling Pope. The procession now approaches the stairs to the Basilica. Pope John is carried up the stairs. For 2 nights and 2 days, he is to lie in state at the confessional altar, so that the Catholic faithful may pay him a last homage. At the portal of St. Peter's, the bier is turned around so that Pope John will enter the basilica with his head toward the altar. The choir sings as he is carried in. Past passing under the balcony where he first appeared as Pope before the people of Rome on the day of his election, October 28, 1958. Pope John on his bier passes the empty tiers and tribunes, the abandoned seats of the now suspended ecumenical council, which he summoned, and which he opened here on one of the happiest days of his pontificate, less than 8 months ago. Only his successor can call the world's bishops together again in General Council.
The burning of the ballot with the white smoke after the successful election of a new pope. Cardinal Ottaviani comes out on the balcony to announce the name of the new pope.
Annuncio Vobis, Gaudium Magnum, Habemus Papam.
We have a pope. The crowd is jubilant.
Eminentissimum, et reverentissimum Dominum, Dominum Johannem Baptistam. Sante Romane Ecclesiae Cardinale Montini.
The new pope is Giovanni Battista Cardinal Montini, the Archbishop of Milan.
Qui sibi nomen imposuit Paulum Festum.
The Pope is Giovanni Battista Cardinal Montini, the 65-year-old Archbishop of Milan, and he has taken the name of Pope Paul VI. In a few moments, Giovanni Battista Montini, Pope Paul VI, will appear on the balcony to bestow his first benediction, Urbi et Orbi, on the city and on the world. III was the Pope who summoned the Ecumenical Council of Trent, and implicitly, by taking his name, Montini has declared
Adiutorium nostrum in nomine Domini. Benedicat vos omnipotens Deus, Pater, et Filius, et Spiritus Sanctus.
the final act of the coronation is now about to take place. The choir sings the hymn, "A Golden Crown is Placed Upon His Head."
Benedictio Dei Omnipotenti, Patris et
Spiritus Sancti descendat super vos in manius semper.
John Kennedy, the first Catholic president of the United States, had never met Pope John while either man was in office. But Mr. Kennedy did see Pope Paul on a European visit that followed shortly on the papal coronation. It may have been a small measure of how accustomed the United States had gotten to the idea that a Catholic could be president that there wasn't much said about that aspect of the call. That whole European trip was a triumph for President Kennedy, and it obviously stirred him. The dramatic peak came in Berlin, as Daniel Shore reported at the time.
As he mounts the platform, he can be seen better, and so the cheers rise. But most of the people around here are news people. Those who are cheering from windows. Here, a close-up shot of the communist barriers. The Vopos, the East German Communist Police, with their binoculars, want to see from their side, too. And on the other side, you can see the East Berliners, who, in spite of everything, have come forward knowing the president would be there. There on the corner beyond were East Berliners gathered. They wanted to see President Kennedy, too, afraid or not allowed to come any closer. The president stands and just looks. It is an amazing sight. And the president comes down now from the platform. He has seen the checkpoint Charlie, which he's worried about these 2 years, a place where at times he thought a war could break out, a place where American and Russian tanks confronted each other, and now at last he's seen it. And the chant of Kennedy reaches a roar as he comes within sight of the crowd as he leaves the Friedrichstrasse. Recognition of the crowd, he insists on going over to all the barriers to see the people instead of getting into his car. And there is President Kennedy, mobbed by West Berliners. He asked for it. Hands stretched forward for one touch, just one touch of this president upon whose nation this city depends. Waving, reaching, grasping forward. West Berlin and President Kennedy. These are people who have come to see him, to cheer him, to wave their handkerchiefs at him. The chant of Kennedy, Kennedy rises. The president is pleased.
There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin. And there are some who say in Europe and elsewhere, we can work with the communists. Let them come to Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the word, Ich bin ein Berliner.
If Berlin was the dramatic peak of Mr. Kennedy's European trip, Ireland seemed to be the most fun. There was, for instance, an informal instance reported by an Irish announcer.
And Mary Ann does the honors, pouring out the tea. And now President Kennedy talking to Matthew McCluskey. And the president moving over now into the center. Father Power, just behind Michael Fleming, behind Mrs. Ryan, and her brother Jim Kennedy. Michael Fleming, who is a distant cousin of the family. And the president obviously takes sugar. President Kennedy has just pressed the microphone and picked it up, and as you undoubtedly heard, just said hello. In other words, what are you doing here?
Mr. Ryan, should we cut this?
Yes.
What about it? Cut yourself.
And he is now cutting a most delicious-looking cake, which was made by Mrs. Fleming, one of the distant cousins. And on the top of that cake, although we can't see it, is a most pleasing and, I believe, a very edible figurehead just of President Kennedy.
Thanks, Mr. Ryan.
Give me a piece of it now.
What?
Give me a piece of it now.
Oh, okay.
Give me a piece of it.
Thanks.
They didn't come up here,
Yeah, they're all shy. They're all shy.
Oh, really? Go down.
They're all.
We want to express our thanks to Mrs. Ryan, who she and her friends who cooked all this. I hope everybody who came with us from the country, who came to speak, all the press and everything, will say something. Because this was a great effort. This was a great effort on their part. We promise we'll come only once every 10 years. And as I said inside, we want to all the Kennedys who went and all the Kennedys who stayed. Wow, Mr. Ryan. You've been terrific. Oh, we're not going yet. No, let's stay because we're late.
Don't mind them.
Don't mind them. What are we going to do with all that with those sandwiches?
The television networks and the press in general gave a great deal of time and space in September this year to a man named Joseph Valachi. He was a convict who had admittedly spent most of his life in illegal pursuits. The justification for all the attention he got was that his decision to tell all would help the law break up the great big syndicate which he, and some more reliable sources, say controls the most of organized outlawry in the country. There hasn't been too much open progress in this endeavor. On television, Valachi told Senator John McClellan, who kept repeating what Valachi said in case the sheltered ordinary citizen did not understand, how he got the kiss of death. It came from Vito Genovese, who was supposed to be the big boss of Cosa Nostra, the blood brother kind of fraternity which controls crime. Genovese was in prison with Valachi when, Valachi said, the big boss told him in an indirect way that he, Genovese, believed that he, Valachi, had become a rotten apple who would have to be destroyed.
The president of both of us, he said, you know, sometimes you buy a barrel of apples, you know, and one of these apples is touched.
It's touched.
Touched. Touch means a little touch. Not all rotten, but a little touch.
I see.
He said, it has to be removed, or it'll touch the rest of the apples.
What significance did that have to you?
Just shaking my head and listening to him.
I said, what significance did that have to you?
I was just shaking my head and listening to him.
You were shaking your head and listening. All right, go ahead.
And unconsciously. I was telling you I was shaking my head. I just caught myself.
Yeah, all right, go ahead. That is what you were doing.
I think we go to sleep. He got up and he said, grabbed my hand and he gave me a kiss.
Grabbed your hand and gave you a kiss?
He gave me a kiss.
Yeah?
So I turned around and I gave him a kiss on the other side.
Yeah?
And,
is that some ritual that goes along in your organization?
No, this is a suspicious kiss.
This is a suspicious kiss. Very well. Very well, go ahead.
So with that, I sleep on the left bottom bunk, and Ralph Wagon sleeps on the right bottom bunk. See, we have one bunk on top of the other. See?
Ralph Wagon.
Ralph mumbled under his breath, the kiss of death.
Some people in England found out during the year that there is more than one way to get a kiss of death. You can catch political death from a pretty girl, if her name is Christine Keeler. And if your name is John Profumo, you can catch it even if your wife stands by you. It was a strange story of sordid games in high places. And it ruined politician Profumo and almost overthrew a government. It was funny in a lot of ways for a while, and then the procurer, who was also a confidant of noblemen, committed suicide. And with Stephen Ward dead, it wasn't so funny anymore. Mandy Rice Davies, one of the girls whom Ward introduced to men who had money to buy the favors of youth and a kind of beauty, is still presumably around. Christine is in jail on account of lying about who beat up an old boyfriend. She'll be out, but probably will not date any cabinet minister in 1964. Christine Keeler and Mandy Rice Davies represented one aspect of the universal influence of womanhood in 1963, but fortunately, there were other aspects. One of the delights of the year was to watch, in a news report from Tokyo, a Japanese cast make fascinating to the Japanese a little story that in the beginning, some 50 years ago when Bernard Shaw wrote it, was a parochial British kind of tale. They produced My Fair Lady in Tokyo, and it turned out that the idea that a poor girl from the streets could be trained to speak high-class language is as fascinating in Japanese as it was in English or American.
雨は主に広野に降る。もう一度。スペインでは雨は主に広野に降る。できた。できたぞ。決めた。大成功だ。さあもう一度。どこに降るか。どこだい。広野。広野。どこの広野。ヘレフォードとハーフォードにはハリケーンはあのお招きありがとう。さあもう一度どこに降るんだい。どこだい。広野広野どこの広野スペイン広野に降り注ぐ雨。
When Hope Cook, a 22-year-old former New York debutante, married the Crown Prince of Sikkim last March, she became that Himalayan nation's second major Western import for 1963, the first being the Prince's Mercedes-Benz, which he drives over Sikkim's 57 miles of roadway. It was a traditional Buddhist ceremony, 45 minutes of praying, tea drinking, gift swapping, and scarf exchanging. The bride's hand was painted for astrological purposes. The wedding luncheon included fish, nettles, noodles, sautéed fern tips, yak cheese, and Sikkimese oranges, which for all intents and purposes are tangerines. Earlier this month, the prince's father died. The prince is now Maharaja, Miss Cook the Maharani, and they now rule Sikkim, a land which contains 3,000 kinds of rhododendrons, and where, legend says, the devil always has to travel uphill. It's reassuring, in a way, in terms of these year-end backward looks, that some things go on from year to year. Fidel Castro was still with us in 1963. His beard was just as long, and so were his speeches, but his reach was shorter. The Russians had taken his offensive missiles away. Possibly to make him feel better, he was invited to Moscow for a long visit last spring. Before Castro ended his 5-week visit, he received 3 medals, attended countless government functions. This one happens to be May Day. And he was credited by the Russians with organizing the triumphant struggle for freedom and independence of the heroic Cuban people and for a worthy contribution to the great cause of peace and socialism. The real importance of the trip, however, was that Fidel and Nikita Khrushchev decided to be friends again. Castro had been sulking ever since October of 1962, when Khrushchev, confronted in effect by an American ultimatum, decided to withdraw those missiles from Castro's island. At Moscow, Castro made a few speeches about the imperialist monster he has for a neighbor and reportedly went home happy. This was another facet of our relations with Cuba. In September, the House Committee on Un-American Activities decided to hold hearings on the illegal visits of students to Cuba. The scuffle started when some young demonstrators entered the House caucus room shouting, "Racists and fascists, go home." People were knocked to the floor, fists flew, chairs were overturned, and there were screams charging police brutality in the chamber. In every year, there are great stories of human endurance or courage or tragedy that don't relate to major movements of history or of nations. This year, there was one that ran for 14 days to a partially happy ending. This is the Felon Coal Mine in Shepton, Pennsylvania. But these men and this equipment weren't digging for coal. They were after Dave Felon and Hank Throne, 2 miners who had been trapped 331 feet below ground for almost 2 weeks.
Hello, Davey. This is Owen's brother, Freddie. Why, I was just talking to Father Roman, and he says if you can't possibly make it to Mass tomorrow, it's all right.
Right.
Yeah.
Make every effort.
He says make every effort, but if you can't make it, it's all right.
All right. I will. I'll try.
Okay.
The man behind the drill was Mike Rank. One wrong move, and he would have sent thousands of tons of coal and earth down on Throne and Felon. He didn't make that wrong move.
Take it all the way up? Give it back to the Indians? Okay.
Oh, Mike, take it all the way up, Mike, and take it out. You did a good job, Mike.
Throne was the first rescued, just 10 minutes before 2 o'clock on the morning of the 14th day.
Okay, Dave, do you hear that? They got handcuffs. Yeah, now it's your turn, Betty. Do you hear me? Dave, he's up now. Do you hear me? Now we're going to get you up too, all right?
Felon, who owned the mine, was up less than an hour later. It would have been a completely happy ending, except for the third man who had been trapped, Lou Bova, presumably in a little hole not far from Throne and Felon. They kept trying for quite a while, but they never found Bova, alive or dead. One of the significant aspects of 1963, before November and after, is that it is the year before 1964 and presidential elections. This has been particularly interesting to Republicans, none of whom is president at the moment. Ever since last May 4th, when he married Mrs. Margaretta Murphy, New York's Governor Rockefeller has been something of a cheerful gambler. He accepted the political risks of divorce and remarriage, but he hopes that time and public exposure to the new Mrs. Rockefeller will turn the odds his way before the Republican convention next year. He has reason to hope. Mrs. Rockefeller's 5th grade yearbook noted her bright smile and perpetual good humor. Her friends today call her Happy. Happy's charm has been evident at a number of social events this year, like this floating charity ball. "Hiya," the governor kept repeating. "Glad to see you. Meet Mrs. Rockefeller." The Duke and Duchess of Windsor know well the perils of divorce and remarriage. Comparisons were inevitable, but the governor never even mentioned abdicating. Anyhow, Governor Rockefeller is an announced candidate for the Republican nomination for president, the only one so far, and here, as he does some campaigning in New Hampshire, he's acting like one. Rockefeller plans to enter the New Hampshire primary in March. And he plans to be in good shape. To underscore a potential president's interest in international affairs, Governor Rockefeller visited Europe in the fall and took a look at something that might give him considerable worry as president, the Berlin Wall. Another notable visitor to Berlin this year was Richard Nixon, a man who almost was president 3 years ago and a force to be reckoned with in 1964, although he hasn't said so. Some people see Nixon as satisfying both liberal and conservative wings of the Republican Party. Besides belonging to the Republican Party and showing an interest in Berlin, Mr. Rockefeller and Mr. Nixon have something else in common, their address. They both live at 810 Fifth Avenue in New York. Somewhat afield from Nixon and Rockefeller, both geographically and politically, is Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. The polls say he is a front-runner for the Republican nomination. The occasion for all of this was a frontier celebration in Prescott, Arizona. High noon on a horse or push-ups in New Hampshire, any way you look at it, it figures to be an interesting year for the Republicans. In October of this year, if Sandy Koufax had asked for the city of Los Angeles as a gift, he might well have gotten it, with Malibu and Long Beach tossed in for the rest of the baseball Dodgers. For the Dodgers beat the New York Yankees in 4 straight games in the World Series, and looking back on it, you should have seen it coming from the first game, which Koufax pitched. Phil Scheffler described his achievement that historic day.
The story here today was Dodger pitcher Sandy Koufax, who broke Carl Erskine's 10-year-old record of World Series strikeouts by fanning 15 Yankee batters. This is the way he did it. Kubek strikes out swinging. Richardson swinging. Tresh looks at third strike. Mantle looking. Maris swinging. Pepitone swinging. Kubek second time swinging. Richardson again. Tresh looking again. Mantle again swinging. Lopez swinging with bases loaded. Howard swinging. Linz swinging. Richardson for the third time. And pinch hitter Harry Bright, the last Yankee of the day, goes down swinging as the Yankees lose the opener and Carl Erskine's strikeout record falls.
It was Koufax in baseball, but the athlete of the year in indoor netless freestyle badminton was Nikita Khrushchev, who gave Dean Rusk a workout at Khrushchev's shore place on the Black Sea. These scenes don't do badly at talking about the difference between 1963 and 1962, so far as America's relations with Russia went. In 1962, the Cuban face-off. In 1963, badminton and the treaty to ban nuclear testing, which President Kennedy called a significant beginning to a possible path out of terror for the world. There were a couple of problems about Berlin, but in general, Khrushchev, for whatever reason, his own troubles or a developing common sense, for whatever reason, he eased up a little. It became clear this fall that professional football is now of age as a major, perhaps the major, American spectator sport. The complicated reasons that people like it are typified in a professional by the name of Y.A. Tittle, who calls plays and throws passes for the New York Giants, again this year's Eastern champions of the National Football League. He throws them to halfbacks like Frank Gifford. He throws them to backs like Joe Morrison. and the people fill the stands and love it. One of the first things that Lyndon Johnson did as president was to rename Cape Canaveral for John Kennedy. Except for that solemn event, the Cape has not been too much in the news in recent months. But there was excitement there last May. America's longest manned space flight, and the only one this year, was launched from what was then Cape Canaveral on May 15th.
3, 2, 1, ignition, liftoff at 04 after the hour, liftoff.
That's Major Leroy Gordon Cooper going up for a 22-orbit ride of 600,000 miles. The launch was just about perfect, and so was the long succession of orbits. But a day and a half later, Cooper's Faith 7 capsule developed some electronic manually, piloting his capsule back to Earth through the deadly heat of re-entry. In his own words, he hit his target right on the old bazoo, and he was immediately plucked out of the Pacific by the aircraft carrier Kearsarge. Cooper spent 34 hours and 20 minutes in space and proved the value of man's mind and training in space. After the suspense, a happy ending. This phone call typifies Russia's space achievement of the year. Nikita Khrushchev chatting with Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space. This is the way they saw it on Moscow television.
Это торжество борьбы народа нашего, и мы горды за
And then in November, the first space wedding. Miss Tereshkova married a fellow cosmonaut, Major Andrei Nikolaev. And after the wedding ceremony in a Moscow wedding palace, there was a big official reception where Premier Khrushchev played the part of father to both bride and groom. He even hinted that they might make space voyages together in a capsule built for two. Every year is the last year for some of us. Along with the deaths of overwhelming impact in 1963, some 56 million others around the world left us to join what newspaper writers used to call the Great Majority. These were 18 of the 56 million. Robert Frost, Adolphe Menjou, William Carlos Williams, Irénée DuPont, Skinny Ennis, David Lowe, Zazu Pitts, Senator Tom Connolly, Glenn Gray, Aldous Huxley, Dick Powell, Hugh Gaitskell, Elsa Maxwell, Estes Kefauver, Tony Anastasia, Clifford Odets, Diana Churchill, Monty Woolley. One obituary of the year was short and pitiful. Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, dead of a respiratory difficulty 2 days after his premature birth last August. John Kennedy took that blow with public dignity and reserve. But along with the record of the years in the presidency, it may have put a little age into his face. Certainly no one would have said in the 1964 campaign what some people said in 1960, that he looked immature for the job. There was no question that he would campaign, At nearly every news conference, a question touched on his try for a second term, and it was clear that he looked forward to it and hoped next November to get the big victory instead of the thin one he got in 1960. His trips were becoming more and more like campaign tours, and he seemed to be enjoying them more than ever. The polls showed him running ahead of any possible Republican candidate, in spite of some unfavorable reaction to his strong civil rights stand. All in all, as 1963 waned, the Kennedy exuberance seemed well-founded. This was the Kennedy family on the 13th of November. It marked one of Mrs. Kennedy's first appearances since the death of her infant son in August. It was at this time that Mrs. Kennedy agreed to take an active role in her husband's campaign for re-election. Thus, she was with him when he went to Dallas on November 22nd. Dan Rather reports.
Texas Governor John Connally, soon to fall wounded before the same assassin as shot the president, accompanied Mr. Kennedy. There were the usual formalities, a rather large committee wearing reception badges. The crowd, many of them in their late teens, seemed particularly charmed with Mrs. Kennedy. Like other airport reception lines, flowers for the ladies. Flowers which were to finally wind up crushed in the floor of the presidential limousine. During these airport formalities, there's usually a rising alertness on the part of the Secret Service men, and the president, as he's done many times before, did not settle for the official reception. Once the reception line was passed, the presidential couple headed for the crowd to move along the fence and shake as many hands as possible in 5 or 6 minutes. This, a presidential routine said to give Secret Service men some of their more anxious moments. Handshakes and greetings for perhaps a couple hundred Texans. The last such greetings a crowd like this would receive from John F. Kennedy. The motorcade's principal vehicle to carry President and Mrs. Kennedy and Texas Governor and Mrs. Connally. The motorcade route was to wind twice through downtown Dallas before going to the scene of the second speech at the Trade Mart. Because the rain had stopped, the limousine top was down. Where the crowds were heavy, the procession moved rather slowly, giving the thousands along the route a good look at the young president and his lady. And further downtown, one man was watching whose purpose was not to welcome the president, but to murder him. Several floors above the cheering crowds, a man waited with a 6.5 rifle. The motorcade moved leisurely down Main Street, where the crowds were the heaviest. It headed for the edge of the business district in Houston Street. The Trade Mart and a luncheon crowd was still slightly less than 2 miles away. Then something happened. The joyous crowd was suddenly panicked. People ran in every direction. Sirens screamed. Terse, excited messages crackled over the radio system of the Dallas Police Department. The president and his party had been rushed in the presidential limousine to Parkland Hospital. As Mr. Kennedy and Governor Connally lay in the emergency room, the limousine stood outside, empty, except for the bouquet of roses Mrs. Kennedy had been carrying in her arms. They lay now forgotten forever in the back of the car. Mrs. Kennedy was in the emergency room, dry-eyed now, controlled, watching as the doctors fought to save her husband's life. She knew from the first, say the surgeons, that the fight was hopeless, the wound too massive and dreadful.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
The President was dead. A senator cried, so did people who were not senators. Back the way she had come, in an ambulance now which bore her husband's body. No roses, no smiles, no waiting crowds. The president was dead, and his widow was taking him home. Federal Judge Sarah Hughes, a friend of Vice President Lyndon Johnson, was called to administer the solemn oath which made Mr. Johnson the President of these United States. The oath was given aboard the presidential aircraft, which then rolled heavy and screaming, rolling and lifting for far-off Washington, bearing the new president and the dead president, and trailing black smoke through the skies of Texas. John Fitzgerald Kennedy's disastrous, mortal visit to the Lone Star State was over.
Now it was Sunday, the moving of the body to the Capitol. 6 gray horses, the caisson, and a spirited riderless horse drew up before the White House. Our Washington correspondents continue the report.
And now the casket. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 35th President of the United States, leaving the White House for the last time. Mrs. Kennedy, Caroline, and John. Now the cortege is forming ahead of the caisson. And now the caisson and the casket are moving down the drive, flanked by 20 military men from the 5 military services, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, and Coast Guard. And now the muffled drum corps has moved off ahead of the cortege down Pennsylvania Avenue.
Oh, she's just about to turn. She's watching a wreath being carried in. It's the wreath of the Vice President. He is accompanying it to the bier. President Johnson, in the utter silence here, is going to the bier with a huge wreath of, it looks to me like chrysanthemums. I don't, it's turned away from me, I can't see it. There will be another huge wreath, I'm told, from the Senate of the United States. The President is going back to stand beside Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Jackie Kennedy and daughter are walking up to the casket. This will be her last goodbye for today. She
People by the thousands visited the rotunda to pay their last respects. The mighty and the meek, alone and in family groups, they filed through the rotunda all night. And then it was Monday and time for the walk to the church.
Now the caisson approaches the northwest gate, followed by the personal flag of the President of the United States. And the riderless horse. And now comes the family, the Attorney General, Mrs. Kennedy, Senator Kennedy. Behind them, other members of the family. Then President Johnson. Apparently another change in plans. And then in cars, the first of the dignitaries. And then, marching along behind, come the heads of state, in no particular formation, just walking ad lib, and members of the White House staff, people from the White House grounds here, some of them falling into the procession to join the walk to the church.
John Kennedy Sr. had taught John Kennedy Jr. to salute when he saw an American flag, and his mother pointed out there was a flag on the coffin.
Now the casket has reached the graveside.
the body, protection of soul, and grace to follow in the way of the wonderful man whom we bury here today. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
The president belongs to the edges.
On Thanksgiving Day, Mrs. John Kennedy returned to her husband's gravesite for the 5th time. And not long after, the late president's family moved back into Georgetown, not far from where John F. Kennedy and his wife had lived before, after they were married, when he was a promising young senator from Massachusetts.
"1963, a television album with Harry Reasoner reporting will continue in a moment."
This is WCBS-TV, Channel 2 in New York.
Lee Harvey Oswald, the man believed to be the assassin of our president, was a truant who became a teenage Marxist, a man who fled to Russia because he hated capitalism, yet found he couldn't live under communism either. He was a failure, a misfit, a man alone. Oswald was arrested less than 3 hours after the president was shot. He was accused first of killing Dallas policeman J.D. Tippit. Then police said they were convinced he was also Mr. Kennedy's assassin. Then the police produced the mail-order rifle they say he used to kill the president. Oswald denied it.
I really don't know what the situation is about. Nobody has told me anything except that I'm accused of murdering a policeman. I know nothing more than that, and I do request for someone to come forward to give me a legal assistance.
Did you kill the president?
No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet. The first thing I heard about it was when the newspaper reporters in the hall asked me that question.
Then on Sunday, November 24th, the incredible happened. Oswald himself was murdered.
This is the basement floor of the Dallas City Hall, and that's a scuffle on the basement floor. It seems He has been shot. Oswald has been shot.
The killer, Jack Rubenstein, otherwise known as Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub operator, a man who said he was a great admirer of President Kennedy. This was the scene in slow motion. From the right, a stocky man in a soft hat moved forward. That was Jack Ruby. A pistol was in his hand. That was the fateful moment, one which would take from the nation its chance to find out what was in Lee Oswald's head. Ruby is subdued and arrested, and Lee Harvey Oswald is dead an hour later, accused but untried, not yet guilty by law. The Presidential Commission, selected to investigate the Kennedy assassination, still is conducting its inquiry. Some government sources predict it may be a year before it is completed. Even then, it may leave many questions unanswered. And Jack Ruby still faces a murder trial. His attorneys say he will plead not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. Presidents die, the presidency lives. On the day of John Kennedy's funeral, Lyndon Johnson was not only the grieving friend and ally, he was the working successor in the most powerful job in the world, meeting and making himself and his wife known to the world leaders who had come to the funeral. Hume of Britain himself knew in his job. De Gaulle of France. Mikoyan of Russia, dozens of others. And 2 days later, the new president went before Congress. The nation heard solemn eloquence in a new accent.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, members of the House, members of the Senate, my fellow Americans, all I have, I would have given gladly not to be standing here today. The greatest leader of our time has been struck down by the foulest deed of our time. Today, John Fitzgerald Kennedy lives on in the immortal words and works that he left behind. He lives on in the mind and memories of mankind. He lives on in the hearts of his countrymen. No words are sad enough to express our sense of loss. No words are strong enough to express our determination to continue the forward thrust of America that he began. For 32 years, Capitol Hill has been my home. I have shared many moments of pride with you. Pride in the ability of the Congress of the United States to act, to meet any crisis, to distill from our differences strong programs of national action. An assassin's bullet has thrust upon me the awesome burden of the presidency. I am here today to say I need your help. I cannot bear this burden alone. I need the help of all Americans in all America. Our most immediate tasks are here on this hill. First, no memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long. We have talked long enough in this country about equal rights. We have talked for 100 years or more. It is time now to write the next chapter and to write it in the books of law. John Kennedy's death commands what his life conveyed, that America must move forward. The time has come for Americans of all races and creeds and political beliefs to understand and to respect one another. So let us put an end to the teaching and the preaching of hate and evil and violence. Let us turn away from the fanatics of the far left and the far right, from the apostles of bitterness and bigotry, from those defiant of law, and those who pour venom into our nation's bloodstream.
Last week, President Johnson came to New York to reassure the United Nations that belief in it is still fundamental U.S. policy. In the new consciousness of danger, security measures had never been tighter.
If there is one commitment, more than any other, that I would like to leave with you today, it is my unswerving commitment to the keeping and to the strengthening of the peace. Peace is a journey of 1,000 miles, and it must be taken one step at a time. We know what we want. The United States of America wants to see the Cold War end. We want to see it end once and for all. The United States wants to prevent the dissemination of nuclear weapons to nations not now possessing them. The United States wants to press on with arms control and reduction. The United States wants to cooperate with all the members of this organization to conquer everywhere the ancient enemies of mankind, hunger and disease and ignorance. The United States wants sanity and security and peace for all, and above all, President Kennedy, I am sure, would regard as his best memorial the fact that in his 3 years as president, the world became a little safer. and the way ahead became a little brighter. To the protection and the enlargement of this new hope for peace, I pledge my country and its government.
As we said some 115 minutes ago, it's been quite a year. Even with 2 hours, there are pictures in the album we didn't look at. The mine in Japan where 452 died, the smashed railroad trains in Japan that killed 162, the place where a town used to be in Italy before a dam broke and the waters obliterated it. And there were events in 1963 that not all our modern abilities could photograph. There is little knowledge and no pictures of what happened to the nuclear submarine Thresher. In a straight line, miner Lou Bova was only a few hundred feet from his fellow men in that Pennsylvania hill, but sometimes man is helpless, and in effect he was as far from pictures or rescue or even consolation as the men on the Thresher dropping down through the crushing water. Since November 22nd, it has seemed to be a year of tragedy. No count has shown that overall, by numbers, it has been a particularly worse year than a lot of others, and there have been some good things about it. But since John Kennedy died, there has been this feeling of unease. I can't explain it, people say to each other, but I can't shake it. There are people who start a little when their telephones ring. There are men who make an extra check around their sleeping homes at night and count the family coming down in the morning. This is all natural enough. The violent death of a great and important man touches us all, not only with our loss, but with the reminder of our own mortality. But something more than this new understanding of life's fragility can come out of our experience. It is here that perhaps the idea of the end of a year is helpful in a way entirely unassociated with marking the movements of the planet. People will say, late in the evening on December 31st this year, a lot more than usual, I'm glad this one's over. And it will be over. At 1 minute past midnight, President Kennedy's assassination and the Pope's death and whatever tragedy you know best, all will be things that happened last year. Since man can remember, widows and orphans have at first refused to believe and then have slowly learned that time does heal. It heals not by wiping away memories or diminishing love or grief, but by a curious process of understanding that comes as news becomes history. News from Dallas or Rome or next door. News may sadden and disturb. History enriches and instructs, if we permit it to. And history rewrites news by the use we make of it for good or ill. 1963 is almost history now. It is the year that John Kennedy was killed. There is a place in the Jewish service of mourning where the rabbi says, let us now think of the virtues of the dead man, the things that we admired about him, and let us promise to do our best to emulate those virtues in memory of him, for this is the only certain immortality. Another way of saying that, with which all religions would agree, is that it is certainly an immortality that we can give. This is Harry Reasoner. Good afternoon.
"1963, a television album with Harry Reasoner. These have been some of the highlights and sounds by which we remember the year. Of the many CBS News cameramen who have contributed to this album were Albert Gretz, Arthur Kingan, Larry Races, Herb Schwartz, Richard Perez, Wendell Hoffman, Robert Hess, Ralph Santos, Bruce Hortel, John Besser, Thomas Craven, Ronald Koza, Fred Dietrich, Cyril Bliss, Mario Biasetti, John Tiffin, Jürgen Neumann, Tomoharu Ishii, Jerry Schwarzkopf, George Markman, Alex Brower, Joe Masraf, Jean Wright-Berger, Merle Severn, Jürgen Tom, Ha Tuk Khan, James Pickrell. Those are news film cameramen. Among the many others who contributed to this pictorial record are the technicians who manned the live television cameras in Rome, Washington, Hazleton, Berlin, and the videotape editors who recorded the remote broadcasts and assembled them for this album. This program, pre-recorded, has been produced by CBS News, which has sole responsibility for the content and editing.